We're talking about peat moss on this edition of Wisconsin Weekend. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. Over thousands of years, plant materials submerged underwater in bogs, they break down to form a type of soil called peat. And the most common is peat from the sphagnum moss plant, which is what we're focused on today. Marshy areas of the northwest part of our state are home to this prehistoric plant that can hold 20 times its weight in water. What questions do you have about sphagnum moss? What do you want to know about this unusual plant and its place in Wisconsin history? We're at 800-642-1234 to join in. David Epstein is CEO and he's owner of Lee in Millston, Wisconsin, which grows and sells a sphagnum moss. David, welcome to the Ideas Network.
Well, thank you, Kate. Glad to be here.
The coolest thing about the show is you never know what you're going to end up talking about, right? So tell us what sphagnum moss is and give us an overview of it.
Well, sphagnum moss is a plant, and unlike peat moss, sphagnum peat, which you mentioned earlier, sphagnum is the growing plant that, when it decomposes, becomes that sphagnum peat. Our marshes here in west central Wisconsin grow the plant, and we harvest that plant for use in horticultural purposes and a number of other uses. It's kind of an interesting plant in and of itself. It's a non-vascular plant, which means that it doesn't get any of its nutrients from a root system. All of its nutrients for it to grow comes through its leaves. It's a stalk of about 10 to 12 inches long, and it's what's so interesting about it is that it has its leaves, its small leaves, have only a single cell structure on it, which makes it perfect for absorbing water and doing other things with the cell structure of the plant. It grows in dense clumps, and it grows in water. And our marshes here in Jackson County, Jackson, Monroe, Clark, and Wood counties grow this product very, very well because of the moist area in the marshes that exist here.
Is that why it grows in Wisconsin but not in other states?
Well, actually, no. It at one time, from what we can do from our research, is that it covered most of Canada and down into Wisconsin, into Michigan, Minnesota, and the northern part of the United States. And actually all around the globe, we believe that it covered that. It's a prehistoric plant. The reason that it's here is because of the glacial action that took place about 10,000 years ago. The glacier, the Wisconsin Glacier it was called, came down and about near Wausau, it split and went around this area, which is commonly referred to as the driftless zone. Mm-hmm. So that which existed north of us was dug out by the glacier and never grew back. But in our area, the glacier left a large lake, the Wisconsin Glacial Lake it was called, and our area was covered with that water for thousands of years. The moss survived underneath that water, which is another interesting aspect of it, in that it can survive underwater, and it can survive if it's frozen. So once the water recedes, once it thaws out, it will continue to grow.
We're learning. Go ahead.
And that's what's really happened on why it is here and does not exist in a lot of the other countries and, of course, the other states in the United States.
We're learning about a prehistoric plant that grows here in Wisconsin. David Epstein is our guide, and he owns Lee, which produces sphagnum moss. Have you used sphagnum moss in your home or at your business? How do you find it useful? Or did the plant not work as you expected? What stories can you share? You have a line at 800-642-1234. You can email ideas at WPR.org. So when did people really start using sphagnum moss, David, and how did they use it historically?
Well, historically, it's been used in this part of Wisconsin for wound preservation. So you have a wound and you put that on it, and because of its antibacterial uses, it's good for wounds. And we have some research that says that the early Americans would use it as diapers for children and for, as I said, for wounds. In World War I, it was used as sponges during surgeries. There are a number of accounts during that time when sponges that would typically use for that were not available. It's used for a number of things in history. In fact, when I did some research for the EPA on sphagnum recently, I found that there were about 2,000 patents that were filed all over the world, many of them Russian and Chinese patents that talked about the uses that you could use it. Some of the more interesting ones I found was that there was a patent issued by Johnson & Johnson that relates to using sphagnum moss as a liquid absorbent medium suitable for use in disposable absorbent articles like sanitary napkins and diapers and the like. There's another patent, a world patent, that was issued that deterred odors from rotting meat in some environments. And then, of course, there are a lot of uses for it that are specific for horticultural purposes. And here in the United States, most of the patents that have been filed and most of the research that's been done has been used for horticultural purposes, for propagation and the like. And that's what we typically use it for, too. Our customers are normally horticulturists or gardeners, and they use it for hanging baskets and a number of uses like that.
So still today, we're figuring out ways to use this moss, and in some sophisticated ways, whether it's in the surgical suite or in the garden. Why is it so versatile?
Well, it's got two properties that we tend to use in the sphagnum product. One of them is that it holds 20 times its weight in water, and that's because of the unique cell structure within the plant. Each one of the cells has a hole in it, which is kind of interesting. And I like to describe it. It looks kind of like your shoe, in that there's a hole, and then there's the surface area that exists inside the cell, inside the shoe, and then on the outside. And it's got a unique property of being able to attract water molecules. So the water molecules get stuck inside, so it holds that water from evaporation for a very, very long time. The second interesting property is that it is sterile. It's got some antibacterial qualities to it, and we're not quite sure exactly why. One of the patents that I read recently talked about its low pH. So we know that it's got a pH of between 3 and 4.5, which is more acidic, and that would restrict bacteria from attacking it. But we also know that it can attract certain elements. It can attract nitrogen molecules, for example. It can hold chlorine molecules better than almost anything else. So it's kind of an interesting cellulose that's in it that has these properties, which lends it to a whole lot of uses that we're using today, and some that we just don't know yet.
Talking with David Epstein, who owns Maserly in Millston, producing sphagnum moss. How do you use it? Have you found it while hiking or exploring northwestern Wisconsin? Let's talk about it. 800-642-1234. Back in a minute here on the Ideas Network. We're learning about sphagnum moss in Wisconsin. It's Wisconsin Weekend. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. Thanks for joining us. It's a long-stranded moss variety used by gardeners often to line hanging baskets, to protect stem cuttings, to grow tropical plants. What do you want to know about this unusual plant and its place in Wisconsin history? What do you want to know about growing sphagnum moss in Wisconsin and then shipping it to customers all over the world? What questions do you have about Wisconsin's so-called invisible industry? Join in at 800-642-1234. Email ideas@wpr.org. David Epstein is owner of Moserly in Millston, which grows and sells sphagnum moss. So, David, where did we start to call this the invisible industry? How did that come about?
It's kind of an interesting story. The interstate highway was put through, I-94 was put through Millston many years ago in the 1970s, and state historians came to the company here and asked my father, who was one of the founders of the company, what was sphagnum moss, because they hadn't heard about it. And as they were talking about it and he was describing it, they said, well, it sounds to me like it's one of Wisconsin's invisible industries because nobody knew anything about it. And it got labeled that. As a matter of fact, there's a plaque that exists on the highway just by a wayside that's a few miles from us that has a plaque on sphagnum moss, and it's called Wisconsin's invisible industry.
So can you find it pretty commonly in garden stores? Where do you pick it up?
You can. We ship it to retailers for consumer use all over the United States. It can be purchased at lawn and garden centers, independent centers, large chains, Home Depot, Ace stores, and the like, all over. And it's typically used, which is kind of, we talk about the uses that it has for it, but people really know it more from a hanging basket standpoint, Kate, as you just mentioned. And it's used to line hanging baskets, wire type of baskets, and planting in it. And what we've discovered is that when you use a substitute product like cocoa fiber or one of the other ones that looks nice, water tends to go right through it. And in Chicago, where they use these baskets that are lined with sphagnum moss, they have found that they can cut down the number of times that they water these on the streets by half, because the water is absorbed into the moss and holds it there by the roots where it's necessary and doesn't fall through.
So what does it do for your tropical plants?
Well, tropical plants need a moist environment, but not a soggy environment. They don't like to exist in standing water. So because the moss can absorb the water and hold it away from the roots until the roots need it, they love that type of environment. Same thing with succulents. We manufacture a wreath that's made out of long fibered sphagnum moss that's used to plant succulents for the table or for hanging on the wall. So it is because it holds so much water, and because it doesn't allow the bacteria, and these tropical plants are very susceptible to death through bacterial action, and because it resists that bacteria, it creates an environment that they can grow and thrive.
So would you say your customer base is mostly garden center type places and florists, or is it other types of businesses?
It's actually not florists as much as it is garden centers where people would buy the product to do the hanging baskets, or it can be used as a soil cover on a potted plant inside a house. It's also used for air layering, which is a method of propagating by cutting a branch on a tree and growing another tree from that branch. It's a seed starter, too. In fact, back in 1944, the USDA put out a bulletin on how sphagnum moss was one of the best seed starters that one could use. We manufacture from our sphagnum moss a seed starter called No Damp Off that prevents a disease from getting into the seeds.
We're talking with David Epstein. He owns Mauserlee in Millston, growing and selling sphagnum moss, and has been doing it for decades now, family business. What questions do you have about Wisconsin's so-called invisible industry? What do you want to know about growing sphagnum moss or how it is shipped all over the world? We're at 800-642-1234. You can email ideas at WPR.org. So let's go to harvest now. David, how do you harvest this moss, and what is that like?
Yeah, well, if you can imagine a marsh with the water as high as your knee, the moss grows in clumps, and it grows there. So we have to get in there. Years ago, we have some photos of people mossing back in the 1880s, and they moss with a pitchfork, and they pull it because you have to disconnect the moss from the ground. And we used to use a pitchfork with its tines hanging down, and you put it into the clump, and then you'd pull. And we refer to harvesting as pulling moss because that's, in fact, what you need to do. You need to pull it. We found, because of labor shortages back in the 80s, that it was pretty impossible to get people to do this very hard work. So we developed a harvest equipment that goes into the marsh and actually does the picking and then puts it on old cleat tracks that we draw out that takes to our drying beds. Because it's wet, and so wet, we need to dry it, and we still use the old method today of sun and air drying it.
So are you in harvest right now then?
Well, it's been so wet here in west central Wisconsin that we haven't been able to get into the marshes yet. Most of our marshes look pretty much like lakes, so we're waiting for the water to go down before we can get our equipment and our men in there.
So how quickly does it grow? Can you harvest it very often?
No, that's another sad part about it, is that it takes about 7 to 10 years to grow back to a length of about 10 to 12 inches where we can harvest it again. It's a renewable plant because of its sporing that creates the next generation of plants. But it takes that long, and primarily because of the winters here. During the winter, growth stops. So when the marshes freeze, there's no growth during that period of time. I was recently in China, and they do grow some moss in China for their own use, and they grow the same amount of sphagnum in about 3 years in a climate where it does not have the freeze and thaw like we do here in Wisconsin. So about 7 to 10 years, we can go back into the marshes. The marshes that we've been on have been harvested for at least 155 years.
How much of the world's sphagnum moss production comes from Wisconsin? Do you know?
Well, we have we figure about half of the world's sphagnum is here. We have the largest marsh in the world. It's close to about 1,000 acres. It also grows in Chile and Argentina. It grows in Japan, a little bit in Norway, and then in New Zealand. And all of those places where it grows has had the same type of glacial action that we have here in Wisconsin, that it was left during the last glacier. But we have about half of the sphagnum moss reserves, we believe, here in the state of Wisconsin.
David, how did your family ever get into this niche production business?
My family grew up in Hartford, Wisconsin, and shortly after my father was born, they moved to Chicago. When he was just graduating from high school, he was looking for work, and he and his father drove north into Wisconsin. One day's drive was this small town called Millston, about 200 people. They spent the night here, and when they got up in the morning, they were amazed at all the pine trees and the beauty that was here, and asked the owner of the motel what was the work that was done here. And they said, well, there's a lot of logging, but there's also something that they do out in the marshes called sphagnum moss. So my father and grandfather took a look at that and thought that there might be an opportunity to sell some of this product back in Chicago, and that started the business, 1932.
Do you think that your family will stay in this business for decades to come?
I would certainly hope so. If not our family, we believe that the product is so unique that there's be a lot of demand for it over the course of the next millennium.
Are you seeing any impact from climate change at all?
We have. There are some threats to our process here. The largest threat is deals with water. If the water remains high through climate change or through dams that are upstream or something like that, we're going to find that it's going to be hard to harvest. It's going to be underwater for a longer period of time. We're concerned about deep wells that are around in this area now with the sand mines and how that might change how the water will flow and the like, and even the reclamation of some old sand mines by planting some invasive plants that might disrupt the growth of the sphagnum.
David, thank you so much for visiting with us.
It's just been my pleasure.
David Epstein is president, CEO, and owner of Moserly in Millston, Wisconsin, growing and selling sphagnum moss for decades in his family. It's Wisconsin Weekend here on The Morning Show. Coming up, we explore the state of recreational fishing and lake fishing in advance of our state's free fishing weekend. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. This is the Ideas Network.